Welcome back to the seminar. Come on in, find a seat, get your notebooks out. We are back in the thick of it today.
We are.
If you have your syllabus for bodies, systems, and stories, a critical history of medicine handy, we are officially landing on Lecture 16.
Lecture 16. And, this is the big one.
I feel like we say this is a big one a lot, but today actually feels like the fulcrum, the absolute turning point.
It really is.
We've spent the last few sessions talking about the history of anatomy, early theories of disease, the rise of surgery. But today we are talking about the moment the entire system changed. We are looking at the Flexner Report of 1910 and its aftermath.
It really is the dividing line. In the history of American medicine, there is essentially before Flexner and after Flexner. It's that stark.
Wow.
If you have ever wondered why your doctor had to go to 4 years of medical school, or why that school was attached to a university, or, frankly, why the tuition was so astronomical.
Right.
Or even why the person in the white coat looked the way they did for most of the 20th century, the answer is almost always found in 1910.
It's the origin story of the modern medical establishment. But before we get into the report itself, which I know we're going to dissect in detail, we need to do a little housekeeping. We need to recap where we left off.
Lecture 15.
Exactly. Lecture 15, to really understand the stakes here, we were talking about proprietary schools.
Right. The before times. And if you recall from the last deep dive, the landscape of medical education in the late 19th century was, well, let's just call it the Wild West.
Chaotic was the word I wrote down in the margins of my notes. It just felt utterly chaotic.
Chaotic is accurate. I mean, you have to remember, for a long time, medicine in America was viewed as a trade.
Like being a blacksmith or a carpenter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily this high science profession. It was a trade you learned. And the schools reflected that. We called them proprietary schools, which is just a fancy way of saying they were for-profit businesses.
And the business model was all about volume then.
Completely. These schools were often owned by a group of local doctors. They would rent a building, maybe a lecture hall, and they would split the student tuition fees among themselves at the end of the year.
So the incentive structure is purely financial.
Purely. So think about it. If you are a professor at one of these schools, are you going to institute a hard entrance exam that turns away 50% of your paying customers?
Absolutely not. You want heads and beds. Or, I guess, butts and seats.
Precisely. So you had these diploma mills just popping up everywhere. There were about 155 medical schools in North America at this time.
155? That's a huge number.
Staggering.
Yeah.
And most had no entrance requirements. You didn't need a college degree, and in some cases, you barely needed a high school diploma. You had students who were functionally illiterate sitting in medical lectures.
And I'm guessing the facilities matched the standards, right?
Oh, the facilities were often non-existent.
Yeah.
We're talking about schools with no laboratories, no libraries, dirty dissection rooms where you might, or might not actually see a cadaver. It was quantity over quality in the most extreme sense.
Okay, so that is the context. We have this unregulated, profit-driven, messy landscape where a doctor could be a brilliant healer or a complete fraud, and the patient had no way of knowing which was which.
And that leads us to the turning point. The mission of this deep dive today is to analyze how we went from that chaos to the rigid scientific system we have today.
And it's not a simple story of good triumphing over bad.
Not at all. We're going to look at how Abraham Flexner's survey standardized medical science, which, let's be clear, was a necessary evolution, but how it simultaneously constructed what we are calling an architecture of exclusion.
That phrase, architecture of exclusion, really stood out to me in the lecture notes. It implies that the exclusion wasn't an accident. It wasn't a byproduct. It was built into the design.
It was structural. It's a fundamental part of the new foundation. When you build walls to keep bad medicine out, you are also making a very conscious decision about who gets to come inside.
And the people who were left on the outside.
The people left on the outside in 1910, specifically regarding race and gender, paid a very heavy price for this standardization.
So that's the central tension we're going to navigate. Was the standardization of medicine worth the destruction of diversity?
Yeah.
It's a heavy question.
It is. A very heavy one. So let's get into the slides.
All right, let's start with body paragraph 1. The muckraker and the mandate.
We have to talk about the man himself, Abraham Flexner, because I think there is a common misconception here.
Mm-hmm.
When I picture the father of modern medical education, I'm picturing a physician, a guy with a stethoscope, maybe a beard, someone who had delivered babies and performed surgeries.
And that is the first shock for most people. Abraham Flexner was not a doctor.
How? He had never practiced medicine. He never treated a patient in his life. He was, by trade, an educator. And specifically, he was the former headmaster of a private high school in Louisville, Kentucky.
A high school principal
Yeah.
from Kentucky is going to reform the entire American medical system.
A very good one, mind you. He ran a school called Mr. Flexner's School, and he was known as a progressive educator. He didn't believe in rote memorization or just, lecturing at kids until they fell asleep. He believed in small classes, hands-on learning, and critical thinking. He was obsessed with pedagogy, the actual method of teaching.
So he viewed medical education through a totally different lens than the doctors did.
Exactly. When a doctor looked at a bad medical school, they might see bad medicine. When Flexner looked at it, he saw bad teaching.
Ah, I see.
He viewed the crisis in medical schools as a pedagogical problem. He saw these lectures where students were totally passive, labs where no real work was being done, and he realized the method itself was broken.
But how does a school principal from Kentucky get the keys to the kingdom? How does he get the authority to audit the entire medical profession?
Well, he had powerful friends. This entire project was commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching.
Okay, the Carnegie Foundation, big money.
Big money, big influence. We are in the progressive era now, the age of efficiency, the age of scientific management and reform. The Carnegie Foundation wanted to survey all of higher education to see where the money was going and how efficient it was. They hired Flexner because he was known for being rigorous, uncorrupted by the medical establishment, and frankly, a bit of a hard nose.
So he's the outsider hired to clean house. And the way he went about it, the outline describes his style as that of a muckraker.
Yes, and that's not an exaggeration. Muckraker is a term we usually associate with investigative journalists like Ida Tarbell taking on Standard Oil or Upton Sinclair writing The Jungle.
Right, exposing corruption for all to see.
And Flexner brought that exact same energy to this report.
He wasn't just, collecting data points and putting them in a spreadsheet.
No, he was on a crusade, a moral crusade. He personally visited all 155 medical schools in the United States and Canada.
In 1909, that travel schedule alone must have been grueling.
It was intense. He was constantly on trains, hopping from city to city. But here is the thing about his methodology that terrified the schools. He was fast. He was incredibly fast. He would sometimes show up at a medical school and stay for only a few hours.
A few hours to judge an entire institution's worthiness. How is that even possible?
Well, that's all he needed. He would walk in, sometimes unannounced, and his first question would be, show me your entrance records. Then he'd ask to see the laboratories, then the library.
And in many of these proprietary schools,
The library was a locked cabinet in the janitor's office with maybe 3 old textbooks. The laboratory was a few test tubes gathering dust on a shelf. He didn't need a week to see that it was a scam. He could smell the fraud the moment he walked in the door.
And his writing style in the report itself reflects that, doesn't it? It's not dry academic prose.
Oh, not at all. It's biting. It's sarcastic. He expressed genuine moral outrage. He would describe the filth of the dissection rooms, the smell, the utter incompetence of the faculty. He was trying to shame the profession into reform.
So he's naming names.
Naming names, describing the conditions in detail. He essentially held these schools up to the light and said, look at this. This is a public menace. This is dangerous.
And he had a comparison in mind, right? He wasn't just criticizing in a vacuum. He had a model for what good looked like.
He did. He was comparing everyone to Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins Medical School had opened in 1893. And it was a completely different animal. It was modeled on the German university system.
Which was the pinnacle of scientific research at the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hopkins was rigorous, science-heavy, and it required a college degree for entry. Flexner basically used Hopkins as the yardstick. If you weren't doing what Hopkins was doing, you were failing, period.
So let's move to slide 4 and talk about the inspection and the findings. When he walked into these 155 schools, what was the specific criteria he was grading them on? If I'm a dean of a medical school in 1910, what do I need to show Abraham Flexner to survive this audit?
It really boiled down to 3 main components. First, and maybe most importantly, strict entrance requirements.
Okay.
Flexner was adamant that you cannot learn modern medicine if you don't understand basic science. It's just not possible. You need physics, chemistry, and biology as a foundation. So he demanded that students have at least 2 years of college science before they even applied to medical school.
Which is a massive leap from can you read and write?
It's a quantum leap. It immediately disqualified the vast majority of people who are currently applying to medical school.
Okay, so that's number 1. What's number 2?
Second, he demanded real laboratory facilities, real working labs. Medicine was shifting from a field of just observation watching the patient, to a field of analysis.
Testing things.
Testing things. Testing the blood, testing the urine, looking at tissue under a microscope. You can't do that without physiology labs, pathology labs, and bacteriology labs. Not just a room with some glass beakers, but actual functioning scientific spaces.
And the third criterion?
Endowment size.
Money.
Money, but specifically independent money. This goes right back to the proprietary problem we talked about.
Right, the conflict of interest.
Exactly. Flexner argued that a medical school cannot be honest if it relies solely on student fees to survive. Because if you need the tuition to pay the bills and pay your own salary, you will inevitably lower your standards to get more students.
You'll pass people who should fail.
You'll pass everyone. He wanted schools to have large endowments from philanthropy or the state, so they could be financially independent. That way, they could afford to fail incompetent students without going bankrupt.
That makes perfect logical sense, but when you apply that three-part filter to the 155 schools...
It was a bloodbath. It was an absolute bloodbath. He exposed the diploma mills for exactly what they were: commercial enterprises, where faculty were literally pocketing student fees and graduating people who had no business being called doctors.
And the verdict wasn't just a slap on the wrist. He wasn't recommending they improve.
No. His recommendation was radical. He recommended closing nearly half of the existing medical schools in North America.
Half?
Nearly half. He argued they were beyond saving. He basically said, burn it down. He believed the public needed to be protected from this commercialism in medicine, and the only way to do that was to eliminate the schools that were driven by profit.
This brings us to a really important philosophical shift, which is outlined in body paragraph 3, medical education as a public trust. This feels like the intellectual core of the lecture, the justification for everything.
It is. It's the moral argument that justifies the destruction. Before Flexner, medicine was largely seen as a trade. It was a private transaction between a doctor and a patient.
My sickness, your services, my money.
Exactly. Flexner and the reformers around him argued that medicine is not a trade. It is a profession. And specifically, it is a public trust.
Let's unpack that term, public trust. What does that actually mean in this context? It sounds good, but what's the substance?
It means that medical schools are not private businesses that can do whatever they want. Because they produce the people who hold life and death in their hands, they answer to society. They have a deep, binding responsibility to the public good.
So it's a social contract.
It is absolutely a social contract. Think of it as an exchange. Society provides the school with two crucial things. First, financial support through philanthropy or taxes. And second, society provides the school with clinical material.
Clinical material, that's such a rough, dehumanizing euphemism.
It is, isn't it? It refers to the patients in the teaching hospitals, who were usually the poor, people who couldn't afford a private physician, who allowed students to learn from their bodies, to practice on them.
So society gives money and access to bodies. What does it get in return?
In exchange, the medical school makes a solemn promise. They guarantee that every single person who graduates with that MD is a competent, safe scientist physician. Every single one. No exceptions.
And we have to remember why that guarantee was so desperately necessary. There's a statistic in the lecture notes that is just staggering. It says that in 1910, a patient had only a 50-50 chance of benefiting from an encounter with a doctor.
Just think about that for a second. Let that sink in. You get sick, you go to a doctor, flip a coin.
Heads, he helps you. Tails, he does nothing.
Or he makes you worse, or he bleeds you, or he gives you a toxic purgative that harms you. The baseline of competence was so low that seeing a doctor was a literal gamble.
So Flexner's goal was to rig the coin toss.
He wanted to rig the coin toss heavily in favor of the patient. He wanted to ensure that when you walked into a doctor's office, the person treating you was grounded in actual science, not just guesswork and tradition.
Which is undeniably a good thing. We all want competent doctors. But, and here's where the aftermath part of the title kicks in, this revolution wasn't free. Financing the revolution, as the next slide puts it.
Right. And this is the fundamental economic reality that Flexner exposed. Science is expensive.
Very expensive.
The old model, a lecture hall, a chalkboard, maybe a skeleton in the corner, was cheap. You could run that on student tuition fees, no problem. The new model laboratories, microscopes, chemicals, full-time salaried professors who do research, instead of just running a private practice, that requires massive, massive capital.
Learning by doing costs a lot more than learning by listening.
Exponentially more. Student fees could no longer even begin to cover the operating costs. So the question becomes, where does the money come from?
Philanthropy.
The philanthropic pivot. And this is where Flexner's career takes another interesting turn. He didn't just write this bombshell report and then walk away.
No.
He eventually became the secretary of the Rockefeller Foundation's General Education Board.
Wait, so the guy who wrote the report saying all these schools need more money to meet these standards became the guy handing out the money.
It was incredibly convenient, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And it made him one of the most powerful men in American education. The Rockefellers and the Carnegies poured millions and millions of dollars into the medical system to build this new scientific model.
But they didn't just give it to everyone who asked.
Oh, not at all. They didn't sprinkle it around like fairy dust. They were incredibly strategic. They essentially created a tiered system.
They picked winners and losers.
They absolutely did. They looked for the schools that were already closest to the Hopkins model schools, like Washington University in St. Louis, Yale, the University of Chicago, Vanderbilt. They identified the chosen ones.
And then flooded them with cash.
Exactly. They flooded those schools with cash to build the best labs, the best hospitals, and to hire the best minds from all over the world.
And if you weren't on that list, if you were a smaller school without those connections,
you starved. It was a very deliberate policy. Survival of the well-funded.
Yeah.
If you couldn't attract that Rockefeller money, you couldn't build the labs. If you couldn't build the labs, you couldn't get state accreditation. If you couldn't get accreditation, you closed your doors. It was a death spiral.
And this leads us directly into the dark side of the report. Body paragraph 5, the architecture of exclusion race. Because when we talk about schools that were starved of funding, we are disproportionately talking about schools that served African Americans.
This is the part of the Flexner story that often gets glossed over in the triumph of science narrative, but it is absolutely essential to this course. The impact on Black medical education was devastating, and we need to be very clear. Flexner didn't ignore Black doctors. He addressed them directly in the report.
Right. There's a specific section on the medical education of the Negro. What was his rationale? Because from the notes, it's clear he wasn't arguing for equality or for Black health for its own sake.
No, not even close. His argument is what historians now call sanitarian racism.
Let's define that. Sanitarian racism.
It's a line of thinking that's rooted in the germ theory of the time, but it's combined with the deep-seated racial prejudices of the era. Flexner did not argue that we should train Black doctors because Black people have a human right to health care.
So what was the argument?
He argued that we should train Black doctors because Black people were potential germ carriers who could infect white people.
That is chilling.
It is. He explicitly wrote about the African American population as a reservoir of disease tuberculosis, hookworm, syphilis. He argued that if you leave the Negro untreated and living in unsanitary conditions, he becomes a direct danger to his white neighbors.
So it's about protecting the white population.
Entirely. So in Flexner's view, the role of the Black physician was not to be a great researcher or a specialist or a surgeon. The primary role was hygiene.
He wanted them to be public health officers, sanitarians?
Exactly. He wanted them to go into their own communities and essentially clean them up to protect white people. It was a purely utilitarian, fear-based argument for their existence.
And because he viewed their role as so limited,
he argued that we didn't need many schools for them, and the ones that did exist didn't need to be as well-equipped as the white schools.
He recommended closing most of them, didn't he?
He did. At the time of the report, there were 7 medical schools for African Americans. Flexner recommended closing 5 of them.
5 out of 7.
5 out of 7. He said only 2 were worth saving. Howard University in Washington, D.C., and Meharry Medical College in Nashville.
And what happened to the others? Schools like Leonard Medical College, Flint Medical College, Knoxville Medical College.
They closed. Leonard Medical College in North Carolina, for example, had trained hundreds of Black doctors who served communities all over the South. But it couldn't meet the new capital requirements. It couldn't get the Rockefeller money. So it shut its doors for good.
The consequence of this pipeline collapse is just staggering. I'm looking at the data in the slide here. By the 1920s, the number of Black medical graduates per year had dropped below the level seen in 1900.
Think about that for a moment. The Black population in America was growing rapidly. The Great Migration was happening. People were moving into cities. Health needs were skyrocketing. And yet the number of doctors available to treat them was plummeting. The system was actively shrinking the workforce that could care for them.
And we are still living with that legacy today, aren't we?
We absolutely are. The profound shortage of Black physicians in the United States today is a direct lineal descendant of the closures of the 1910s. Flexner bottlenecked the entire pipeline into just 2 schools, and even those 2 were left marginalized and chronically underfunded compared to the elite white universities.
It's such a stark example of how raising standards can function as a tool of exclusion, whether it's intended that way or not. And it wasn't just race. Slide 10 takes us to the architecture of exclusion gender.
Right. And the argument here was slightly different, a little more subtle, but the end result was exactly the same.
So before the Flexner Report in the late 19th century, there was actually a fairly robust movement of women's medical colleges.
Yes, there was. These were separate institutions, like the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, which is a very famous one. These were schools founded by women, for women, specifically to provide a supportive environment in what was already a very male-dominated field.
So how did Flexner dismantle that system? What was the logic?
He used the efficiency argument. The progressive era was obsessed with efficiency. He looked at these separate colleges and said, this is wasteful. Why do we need duplicate infrastructure? Why have a lab for men and another lab for women? It's far more efficient to have co-education.
So his recommendation was to close the women's colleges.
And let the women attend the big university medical school.
Which on the surface sounds like integration. It sounds almost progressive. Let them into the big leagues.
On the surface, yes. And that's why it was so insidious. But it was a trap.
A trap? How so?
Because the women's medical colleges did close. Most of them, anyway. They either folded completely or they merged with larger male-dominated universities. But once the women started applying to these co-ed universities, they hit a wall.
The quota system.
The quota system, exactly. The universities, now in control, said, okay, we'll take women, but only a handful. They instituted these informal, unwritten quotas, typically capping female enrollment at around 5% of the class.
And how did they justify that? What was the reason they gave for capping the numbers?
Well, this is where the Victorian backlash comes in. There was a pervasive cultural argument, often dressed up as science, that women lacked the scientific mind for this new, rigorous biomedical curriculum.
That their brains weren't suited for it.
Right, or that the physical and mental strain of medical school would damage their reproductive health, making them unfit for their primary role as mothers. It was utter pseudoscience, but it was incredibly powerful and widely believed.
So the result was a massive drop in representation for women in medicine.
A precipitous drop. In 1910, just before the report, women made up about 6% of physicians in America. By the 1940s, after decades of this new system, that number had fallen to less than 5%.
It went down.
It went down. It didn't start climbing back up significantly until the social movements of the 1970s. So Flexner's argument for efficiency essentially set women in medicine back by half a century.
It's just infuriating to look at those graphs. You see this progress happening in the late 1800s, this upward trend, and then boom, 1910 hits, and the line goes flat for decades.
All in the name of higher standards.
So we have to weigh this. Slide 14 calls this section the balance sheet. We're at the end of the lecture, and we have to tally up the wins and the losses. On one side, we have the death of the snake oil salesman. We have the birth of modern, effective, science-based medicine.
And we cannot minimize that. That is a monumental achievement. The Flexner Report achieved its primary goal. It standardized American medicine. It created the biomedical model that gives us antibiotics, organ transplants, complex surgeries.
It made the American medical education system the envy of the world.
It did. For a long time, it was seen as the absolute best. And it protected the public from gross, demonstrable incompetence. These are huge wins for public health.
But the cost.
But the cost was incredibly high. Standardization came at the price of exclusion. Medicine became a profession for the white, urban, upper middle class. If you were poor, if you were rural, if you were black, if you were a woman, the door was largely slammed shut in your face.
The rural deficit is another point on the balance sheet that I think gets overlooked.
It does, but it's crucial. Remember those bad proprietary schools we talked about?
Yeah.
They were everywhere. They were in small towns in Iowa and Arkansas and North Carolina, and they produced doctors who tended to stay and practice in those small towns.
So when you close them?
When you close them and centralized medical training in a few elite urban universities, you stripped rural America of its doctors. We're still talking about the rural doctor shortage today. That geographic disparity started right here with Flexner.
And finally, the last point on the debit side, the intellectual monoculture.
This is the epistemological cost, the cost to how we think about healing. Flexner cemented the idea that there is only one valid way to do medicine, the biomedical, materialist, scientific way. Everything else, homeopathy, osteopathy, folk medicine, midwifery, was suppressed, delegitimized, or in some cases outlawed.
So we gained scientific rigor.
But we lost a certain diversity of thought. We arguably lost some of the art of medicine in favor of the pure science of medicine.
It's like industrial farming. We created a monoculture. It's very high yield, but it's also fragile and has driven out all the other variety.
That is the perfect analogy. Absolutely perfect.
So slide 15 brings us to the conclusion, living in Flexner's world. Because we are, aren't we? This isn't just history.
We absolutely are, 100%. If you walk into any medical school in America today, the basic structure, 2 years of basic science in the classroom, followed by 2 years of clinical rotations in the hospital. That is Flexner's design.
The 2+2 model.
The 2+2 model. The fact that the medical school is an integral part of a major research university. That's Flexner. The intense focus on research and publication for faculty. That's Flexner. We are still living in the house he built.
But there is, as the notes say, unfinished business.
A lot of it. The disparities, the racial and gender gaps that were codified and baked into the system in the post-Flexner era are still with us. Modern medicine is still struggling to undo that original architecture of exclusion.
You see it everywhere.
We see it in the debates over affirmative action in medical schools, in the efforts to recruit more minority students, in the discussions about cultural competence. We are essentially trying to retrofit Flexner's house to be inclusive when it was originally designed from the ground up to be exclusive.
And it leaves us with this final, really provocative thought for you, the listener, to take away. The lecture notes ask, is it possible to have high scientific standards without elitism?
And that is the question of the century, isn't it? Can you have rigor without restriction? Can you protect public safety without creating a professional caste system? I don't think we've fully solved that puzzle yet.
It's something to chew on. Next time you see a diploma on a doctor's wall, think about the 155 schools that used to exist and the ones that didn't make the cut.
And think about who isn't in the room because of it.
Well, that wraps up Lecture 16, a really foundational one. But the story continues. We've reformed the school, but the students have to learn the trades somewhere practical.
That's right. Next time, in Lecture 17, we're moving from the classroom to the ward. We're going to talk about the rise of the teaching hospital.
Okay.
We'll look at how the hospital itself transformed from essentially a place for the poor to die into a temple of science where doctors learn by doing on real patients.
I can't wait. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into the history of medical authority.
See you next time.